Performed by Shannon McManus. Chapter 1. The barking of a man. Whoever was at her door wasn't from Whiskey Creek. Her family had lived in the area for generations. Everyone knew that this was the Veneta farm, that the aging Fiona and Herbert had died within months of each other, and she was living here alone. "Hello?" the man called again. "Please, someone answer me." Should she respond? Letting him hear her voice would tell him she was a woman, which didn't seem smart. But she had her dogs pushing my bike. Got me good, too. The way he forced his words through his teeth suggested that he was in pain. But maybe he was faking it. Maybe he was planning to rob her, rape her, possibly kill her. "Where did this happen?" she asked. He attempted to laugh, but the sound died almost immediately. "Hell if I know. I've never been around here before." "Then what made you come now?" darkness that hovered at the edges of his mind could have overtaken him at any time. He had to push it away, resist its strange allure, or he wouldn't come out of this alive. What was probably only a few seconds seemed like an eternity, but he finally staggered through the door and almost knocked Callie to the ground. She was just entering the barn, obviously looking for him and her dog. "Get back!" He dragged her with him into the cool, clear night, but it wasn't easy, including the room Levi had been using. Seeing the charred remains of the bed where he'd been sleeping when the fire broke out left quite an impression on him. But he couldn't focus on that, not right now. Chief Stacy had just approached him, asking if he'd come inside the house so they could talk. Levi was tempted to put him off, to act as if he was still trying to salvage some of his belongings from the ashes. He might be able to slip away among the departing firemen, many of whom had shown up in a window, which had to be boarded up until Callie could get it fixed. Sailing through a window like that? Believe me, his injuries could have been a lot worse. Levi raised his eyebrows. See what I mean about luck? I'd call that devotion. He must like you a great deal to go to such lengths to keep you safe. As if to prove that he did indeed like Levi, Rifle returned to his side and lay at his feet. Stacy motions. No previous arrests. It required effort not to curl his hands into fists. Isn't that good? It would be, if it was accurate. But I have reason to believe it's not. An uneasy feeling skittered down Levi's spine. Godfrey mentioned that you were in the military. Is that true? He said nothing. It is, isn't it? Fine. He no longer had his leather coat, his backpack, his extra clothes and shoes, just what he had on his back and the boots he'd worn the night he was attacked by those dogs. He'd cleaned off the blood and left them by the back door to dry. But that was enough. He'd always been able to fend for himself. It was when others depended on him that life got complicated. So she was right. It was best that he leave now, before whatever had started here grew any. She also smoothed lotion over her arms and legs and sprayed on some perfume. But by the time she heard the shower stop, she'd just about talked herself into calling off the whole thing. She was exploiting Levi's ignorance when it came to her situation, and she had no right. What do I do? That question whirled through her head a million times, but when he emerged from the bathroom completely nude, hair wet and uncombed and curling slightly around his ear, seconds ago, he'd been determined to do so. But he couldn't persuade his heart to betray Baruch, not even her memory. I see. Callie smiled, but he could tell by the emptiness in her eyes that her pleasant expression was a front. I understand. To be faithful to someone, that's an admirable thing. She scrambled to reclaim her robe, as though she was suddenly embarrassed to let him see her without it, and he regretted the excitement and attraction she'd experienced so naturally with Levi. But trying to turn friendship into love hadn't worked. As a matter of fact, it was such a poor substitute, she knew she could never settle for something so diluted again, even if she had another 50 years to live, which she didn't. I told you he wouldn't hang around forever. With the barn burned, there's no way he can paint it. But he could have said goodbye and fulfill you. Because I'd have to leave you and the rest of our friends. I could never replace what we have. She snuggled closer. I feel the same. And I'm afraid of what'll happen to me there. How I'll change. You'd come out of the closet, wouldn't you? I wouldn't be able to stay in it. Not in an environment where it feels safe to be who and what I really am. Maybe I could pull off a double life for a while, but... That he was searching for the right words, and she was fairly confident she didn't want to hear it. She'd already had another difficult conversation with her parents, one in which she'd had to assure them, several times, that the barn could be rebuilt and she'd be safe. She certainly didn't want to talk about anything else that would be painful, especially what had happened when she'd put on that silly bustier. She'd been foolish to buy it in the first place. If Levi was interested in her, Levi figured it might be the arson investigator, back with a few questions, or wanted to take a second peek at the barn. Or Chief Stacy. Had he finally discovered Levi's true identity? Was he here with an arrest warrant? It was neither. He held rifle back as he opened the door to find a big, barrel-chested man, salt and pepper hair buzzed short, on the stoop, scowling in the direction of the damaged barn. "Look at that," he said the moment Levi opened the door. "Multiple sclerosis a few years back. That disease is a tough one, you know. Some days are better than others." "I'm sorry to hear about it. I wish to hell it was me instead of her." As he heaved a deep sigh, Levi had no doubt he was absolutely sincere. "But we all have problems," he went on. "Yes, we do," Levi said. Boone sized him up. "You're a nice-looking fella. No wonder my daughter likes you." Levi, or I'll continue to live in fear. Chair swing he'd hung from the ceiling of his old-fashioned porch. If Denny set that fire, I have to hope the police will be able to prove it and prosecute. Dexter stopped the swing. "Cowley, Levi and I are just hanging out until the police can get to the bottom of this arson. Why would I need to let him know that I'm a terrible investment of his time, that there won't be any return?" "Knowing you is a privilege," he insisted. "No matter what." "Come on. It's too intense for a new acquaintance. We're not even sleeping together." He let go of her hand to tie the leather thong that was coming undone. "Friends with Simon O'Neill's wife. Take whatever help they can give you." She wanted to live so desperately that for a moment she considered letting him convince her. She wasn't sure Simon would be able to do anything. His contacts weren't in the medical field, but he was treated like a god by just about everyone. His level of fame made such a difference. And on top of that, in a world where money mattered so much, paying the right people probably... Take a wild guess. You looking for trouble? If trouble is what it takes. What the hell's that supposed to mean? Pal demanded. It means I know you guys did it, Levi said. I know you started the fire at the farm night before last. No, we didn't, Pal argued, but the expression on Denny's face led Levi to believe he was dying to take credit for what he'd done. To convince Levi that he was as big and bad, my background search turned up zilch on a Levi McLeod from Seattle. No parking tickets, no speeding tickets, no military service, nothing. So, there could be a mistake. There's no mistake. He's not being straight with us. I'm convinced of it. She nibbled at her bottom lip while watching the other cars on the road. Post-traumatic stress disorder affects a lot of our soldiers, makes them do things that might seem crazy. She was flattered. Will you keep that in mind? He asked before she could respond to the divorce statement. Callie shoved her transmission back in park. Was he serious? So what if he had a steady job? She'd never looked at him as a possible love interest. He seemed much older, had been married since she was in high school. But the divorce changed nothing on her part. She didn't find him remotely attractive. Since when had he decided he'd like to date her? Not really. A pension's not what I need right now. He held his fork loosely in one hand. What do you need? To get well, she thought, but smiled to camouflage the gravity of her reality. A tasty dinner. After washing up, they decided to watch a movie. They were both exhausted. But Levi couldn't relax when he sat on one end of the couch and, instead of sitting on the other end, Callie by getting in the ring, and he still had a lot of interest in the sport. He usually watched the matches with his brothers, but since he'd bought her a 2-bedroom home in town, complete with a white picket fence he'd built himself, he didn't see his brothers after work quite as often as when they'd all been living down in the river bottoms. She wasn't herself on Friday, he said. But what about Sophia? You didn't mention her or Ted. Folding her arms, Cheyenne leaned against the door jamb. Something in his expression made her cheeks flush with warmth. Yes? He caught her by the wrist and pulled her toward him. I was wondering if you might be interested in making a baby with me." Her heart lodged in her throat. She'd been waiting for him to ask. She knew if she brought it up, he'd say yes, just to ensure that she wasn't denied anything she really wanted. But it was important to her that he crave a child just as much. "You've raised your brothers. I feel terrible about it because I know she regrets it." Stunned silence met this announcement. Maybe they'd had their suspicions, but no one had expected him to confess. Baxter admired Kyle for being willing to own up to what he'd done. It proved that he was worried too, and that he cared more about Callie than about covering his tracks. "I doubt that's it," he said, hoping to ease some of the surprise and awkwardness that had sprung up. "You've been with Callie?" 2 years was a long time for a man to ignore his sexual appetites. He was learning just how relentless those appetites could be. But he'd already screwed up with her once. He'd had her put on that lingerie, then pulled back almost the second he touched her. He'd rejected her when she was most vulnerable, when any woman would be most vulnerable, and he doubted she'd be willing to trust him again. She wouldn't want to run into the same problem. For that matter, neither did he. Desire. Whoever was at her door wasn't giving up. The gongs of the doorbell repeated themselves, sounding deep and hollow in the expansive house. Resting her head against the supple leather of her chair, Sophia let the book she'd selected from her own shelves fall into her lap. "Go away," she murmured. "I don't know who you are or what you want, but it doesn't matter." It was most likely a friend of Alexa's. Few people came to the door for Sophia. "In a few minutes. You can use the bathroom then." "I don't need to use the bathroom." Of course he didn't. She just thought that purposely misunderstanding might be enough to send him back to the living room. "What do you want then?" "I'm looking for a second chance. Can you give me that?" No, she couldn't, for several reasons, not the least of which was what he told her yesterday. His feelings for the woman who'd come to such a heartbreaking end could not have... "How much you want me would be nice." The world seemed to shift beneath her feet. She drew a deep breath, hoping to steady herself. "If I tell you how much I want you, you might not realize you can stop if you need to." "I'm not planning on turning back." "But the regret might not be worth it for you." "I can see I'm going to have to shut you up my own way." "I'm sorry, but..." She didn't get the rest out because he covered her, managed to hang on to the thread of the conversation. She groaned, and he grew too distracted to continue. She let her head fall back as darts of pleasure shot through her. "This isn't comfortable. Let's get the hell out of here," he said, and scooped her into his arms. They'd already tried making love in the shower, but this one was too old and small. So far, he'd succeeded only in donning a rubber and pulling down the damn shower rod he'd just fixed. He wanted Callie in bed. Now. They were wet, and he didn't stop so they could dry off. He hoped she wouldn't care. He couldn't wait another second to feel her close around him. Bed and pulled on her pink robe, since his only clothes were still wet. But the kitchen was as empty as all the other rooms. She didn't even seem to have eaten. The clock hanging on the wall caught his eye. It was just before 6. The sun had barely come up. Where could she be? Rifle whined. Callie had shut her dog in the mudroom. Levi didn't know why she'd done that. She generally let him wander throughout the house. Maybe she was afraid the dog would disturb him. Arms, she leaned her head back on the bed. Falling in love now beats never falling in love at all. Some people had to take what they could get. Where was she? Levi had washed and dried his clothes, fixed the shower curtain rod again, made up the bed, and filled Rifle's food and water bowls. He'd also answered the door to Godfrey, who'd removed his stitches. Then he'd weeded and watered the garden and stabilized to his concern, like the fact that they'd made love last night, and he thought if she had to get up early and leave, she would have mentioned it, or that he was impatient to see her again because they had unfinished business. He hadn't meant to sleep for hours, hadn't meant to leave her unsatisfied, as if he didn't care about her fulfillment. That was a small thing compared to her overall safety, but the way their time together had ended contributed to his sense of unease. Maybe she was so disappointed she went a week ago for lunch, but we decided that, to make a day of it instead. It's summer after all, and neither of us really has a vacation planned. "Hi, Kyle." Callie chipped in to let him know she was in on the conversation. "Why haven't you two been answering your phones?" he asked. Baxter fielded this one. "We were out sailing, so we left them in the car." "Sailing?" "That's right." Callie wondered if Levi was still at Kyle's for time. "But," he kissed her cheek, "you've made a believer out of me." Levi was anxious to return to the farm. He hadn't seen Callie since he'd carried her to bed from the shower. He'd thought of her, though, almost constantly, but not for the reasons he'd expected to. Surprisingly, he felt no remorse for getting involved with her. The opposite was actually true. It was as if he'd finally broken free from everything that had held him captive. This time she was more careful about hiding her reaction. "Not really. Why?" "You look thinner than the pictures I've seen of you, and most of your clothes are fitting pretty loosely." She shrugged as if it was nothing to be concerned about. "I had a few pounds to lose." "So you're okay?" he asked. "What do you mean?" Sometimes you seem so tired." She caught her breath. She felt greedy asking for anything else, so she simply braced herself for the worst. She knew the happiness they'd found together couldn't last, but God, was it good while it did. Nothing terrible happened the next 3 days. The week continued to pass in the same idyllic fashion as that perfect night. She and Levi got up early and laughed and talked while they gardened, and occasionally had a water fight. After that, they showered together. Sometimes they made love if they had time, give her statement more conviction. "I've decided I'm going to get well so I won't have to tell him." "I like that idea." She sat next to him and covered his hand with hers. "I felt great this week, Bax. I think recovery might be possible." He wouldn't quite meet her eyes, which told her he was afraid that was wishful thinking. "Why weren't you at coffee yesterday?" "It's hard to be around the gang right now. I don't like deceiving them." "No." "Everything's complicated right now." She put her glass in the sink and dug her keys out of her purse. "What am I going to tell Levi when my friends come over and demand to know what's wrong with me?" He drummed his fingers on the table as though the answer was obvious. "What?" "At some point, you might consider the truth." But then Levi would not only leave, he'd hate her for lying to him. What if she could beat her disease instead? Stacy pointed to the logo on Levi's shirt. "Your new grease monkey ran a red light." Joe's eyebrows knitted. "Sucks for him. Which one?" "Does it matter?" "That one right there." The police chief pointed at the closest traffic signal, only a block away. "Are you sure it was that one, Chief?" Stacy seemed bored when he answered. "Positive." Joe stretched the muscles in his neck as if he'd put in a hard day's work, refused to have a woman do battle for him. She'd had no problems with the people in her hometown before he came. He wanted to be sure there'd be no problems after. "Levi?" "Nothing." He breathed against her neck as his mouth moved lower. "I just missed you." She held his face so she could look into his eyes, but he allowed that only for a second, before stripping off her shirt and kissing her breasts. He was driven to possess her in a way he'd never thought he'd feel so strongly about a woman again. Breathing deeply, enjoying the scent that was so uniquely her. Please tell me that wasn't goodbye. At her place and taken 2 cars so they could all arrive at once. Ted was still on deadline for his next book and couldn't come, and no one had been able to reach Sophia. "I hope this doesn't make matters worse," she muttered to no one in particular. Eve was closest to her, but she probably would have been the one to respond. The guys tended to favor less intervention rather than more. Eve had all but twisted their arms to get them to participate in this. We have to do something more upbeat than Fridays at Black Gold had been the past several weeks. Cheyenne was especially excited when Levi finally emerged from the bedroom. She liked him immediately. She liked the way he looked at Callie. But then she caught a glimpse of her husband's face and realized that something was wrong. He wasn't saying anything. He was just sitting on the couch, glowering. Slipping through the others who were returning their plates to the kitchen or getting more coffee, she sat down next to him. As far as he was concerned, that was fair and a blessing to them both. But he had to think of some kind of logic to back up his opinion, since they didn't have any idea about Callie's illness. Dylan shoved a hand through his hair. That may be true, but I don't want to narc on him. Even to protect one of our best friends? Cheyenne seemed surprised, and that made Dylan shift uncomfortably in his seat. I don't want anything bad to happen to Callie. So tell me. Hang on, Kyle said. I'm going to put you on speakerphone. Eve, Baxter, Noah, Dylan, Shy, and Riley are with me. You're putting them all on? I am. I don't want to be the one to break this to you. He was going to break something to her, but she was the one with the secret. Baxter, what's going on? She demanded when she could hear the others. I think it's time sailing in San Francisco. Sure, she'd been short of breath or occasionally seemed tired. She'd lost a few pounds, too. But he'd questioned her about those things. She'd told him she was fine. Heart pounding so hard he felt it might leap right out of his chest, he stood perfectly still, listening to the other voices coming from inside the room. Her friends were all on the phone with her. Except for Baxter, they hadn't known she was ill either. There was crying. I see. With a curse, Kyle bent and scooped her into his arms. Come on, it's chilly out here. Let's get you inside. It's just us again, she said, as he whistled for Rifle to join them and put her on the couch. He covered her with a blanket, then smoothed the hair away from her face. So we'll work with what we have. How? She managed a brief smile as she wiped her tears. Kneeling before her, upset her mother. In a minute. Baxter managed to unfasten another button on his expensive shirt. Tell me something. What? She said. He waited to make sure her mother was gone before continuing. Has Dylan ever mentioned seeing me with a guy? At this, she sat up straighter. What do you mean? I mean what you think I mean. I was on a date once, such comments. How have you been? Leo asked. Lost, Levi realized. He'd been lost for so long he didn't know if he'd ever find himself. And it was difficult not to blame his father, who'd been so damn overbearing. Fine. He indicated the scars on his arms. Those marks are... I was attacked by a dog a few weeks ago. Why? Shit like that happens when you're out on the road. He's martial arts, which you love, and you can live with me until you get on your feet. Levi stuck a French fry in his mouth. I don't need your help. Then what will you do? You're not going back into the army. No, definitely not. He wasn't sure what to do next. He'd thought he'd stumbled on a place he could call home when he found Whiskey Creek, but without Callie, it wouldn't be any different from all the other towns he'd passed through. So what then? Skeptical, too. It was hard to tell. He sat next to her, but he was too busy watching her, looking concerned, to really participate in the conversation. Callie ignored him. She hated the way they all seemed to be waiting for the moment she might keel over. I sort of miss her, Eve said. She was always very supportive. Always? Ted let out a preposterous laugh. Oh, how quickly they forget. She's been nice the past... It wasn't until he stood right outside Callie's room and could hear the quiet murmur of voices within that he began to feel uncertain. Was she awake? In pain? Was there anything he could do to make her happy before she died? Staring down at his shaking hands, he closed them into fists. Then he opened them again, drew a deep breath, and went inside. Her parents were there. At least, He assumed the woman in the wheelchair was Callie's mother. He'd never circumstances. Wouldn't you agree?
This
Voice. Leave